Hi everybody. So I speak very loudly, so I don't really need a microphone. But so my name is Anke Schwittay. I'm a professor at Sussex University, and you've just seen some pictures from our lovely student housing in Tom's presentation. And a lot of what I had prepared was actually already said in previous presentations. So I've been furiously scribbling on my presentation. I think what I'm going to do is actually pull some things together and fill in some of the gaps, some of the things that haven't been mentioned yet. But first, a little bit about myself and my involvement with Student Housing Co-ops. I wrote a book called on creative university. So my interest was in how can we make university teaching more creative, more practical, more experiential. As I said, I'm teaching in anthropology and international development. And my idea was that we want to give our students the ability to imagine alternatives to some of the existing crises, including the acute student housing crisis. And one of the students I interviewed for my book was one of Tom's colleagues, Ruthie, one of the co-founders of CSOT. And she said, well, we've actually set up a student housing co-op at Sussex Uni. And I was completely amazed. I'd never heard of it. And I said, wow, students getting together, setting up a housing co-op. For me, that was a really perfect example of students using some of their uni knowledge, but also other knowledge, and actually doing something about the housing crisis. So that was in 2020, and since 2021, I've been studying student housing co-ops in the UK predominantly. So I'm going to be drawing on this research in my presentation, but surprise, surprise, starting off with Sanford, which started as student cooperative dwellings. Again, I'm not going to really repeat what has been said about it, even some of the pictures, and John Hensbrook, which is really interesting. What I take away from Sanford is actually a lot of hope, because as Francesco said, it started in 1967-68 when students kind of emerged as political subjects. But there was no legislative framework, there was no financing, there was no model of a student housing corpus for students or for young people. And John Hens, who was at the time the president of the University of London Union, with a lot of high-level connections, right? We had a picture of him with Prince Philip. The president-elect of the Liberal Party at the time was involved, several university chancellors and vice-chancellors, a former leader of the House of Lords. So he was able to bring together a really kind of, powerful group of people. It still took 5 years for Sanford Cooperative Dwelling actually to get off the ground. And by that time, it wasn't a student housing co-op anymore, but it's still the first purpose-designed housing cooperative for young people on quite a large scale. And I think from establishing a model, kind of there's hope in that. It was possible at the time, and we've heard about a lot of challenges that housing co-ops are facing. But I also think that, it is possible, and there are models that are working, and I think we can learn from these. And as you heard, the co-op is still going as a general housing co-op, and there's actually on the co-op website links to a whole bunch of BBC documentaries from those early years, which are absolutely fascinating to watch. So I would highly recommend that. The next attempt actually brings us to Manchester, and I don't even know if people from Manchester here. So took until kind of the early 2000s, but there was a group in Manchester led by an architect called Charlie Baker, who at the time was involved in a kind of an urban design cooperative called Urbet. And he kind of, again, brought a group of people together interested in student housing cooperatives. There was some good interest from the cooperative group, from the National Union of Students and several Manchester universities. The other interesting thing is that they were very proactively reaching out to North America, because as we've already heard, there is a very long-standing, successful student housing movement, especially in the States, a little bit in Canada. So they got in touch with a guy called Jim Jones, who is like the eminent historian. He has written a book on the history of student housing co-ops in North America, which is a fantastic resource. There's actually a picture of Jim Jones when he came over with the NUS president at the time and some of the Manchester students who were involved in that initiative. You can also see the cover of the report that was commissioned for, Charlie Baker and his kind of, his urban design studio. And then Harry, this is a member, or was a member of the current MASH Corp. What happened is, so again, a lot of support, money to finance this report. It didn't come to anything. And one of the big reasons was that the NUS leadership changed. So Verity at the time, who was really supportive and wanted to put student union resources behind it, she lost the election, and the next student union leader, NUS, so National University Union of Student Leaders, just had no interest. And that's one of the reasons why it didn't go ahead. I also think it didn't go ahead because it was a very top-down model. And if I have anything learned from my research, you cannot do student housing corps top-down. It has to be a bottom-up effort, which brings us to Edinburgh and Birmingham. And I'm not going to spend any time on Edinburgh because we've heard so much about it. But there is a second house which also celebrates its 10 years anniversary this year, and that's the Birmingham Student Housing Corp, which you can see in the middle there, middle photo. That's the founding students with one of the Birmingham city councillors at the time. What I want to say about this period is that, and that speaks to something that's been mentioned before, and student as activists and student as protesters. And Sean Formello, who is one of the Birmingham co-founders who I interviewed, has said repeatedly, we would not have any student housing corps had it not be for the 2010 student protests. And I don't know how familiar you are with that, but in 2010 was when the coalition government tripled, I think, university fees to 9,000. Massive student protests in London, the storming of what became known as the Millwall riots, the storming of the Conservative headquarters, lots of protests and occupations at individual universities. Obviously, the battle was lost, student fees were raised, and a lot of, I think, people involved in that movement became disillusioned. But you also had kind of a second reaction, and that's a number of activists becoming really interested in alternatives, saying we've lost this battle, the fees are going up. What else can we do to enable access to education? And they focused on housing as something, this is a big expense that students have. So focusing on housing, but building alternatives and the interesting cooperatives that came around. We also had at the time, the UN had the year of cooperatives. So there was a lot of general interest in cooperatives, a lot of networking happening. But the other thing that came out of 2010 is that students gained a lot of experience with political mobilization. They were very, they described themselves as battle-hardened. They were very committed and very experienced organizers, and they gained a confidence that then kind of 2-3 years later allowed them to, take over a 106-bed building and saying, within I think they had only about 6 months between getting the building and moving in and getting 106 people together. And I've interviewed some of the co-founders who told these stories that we've learned so much about. The other thing I read a paper that said the 2010 student mobilizations were kind of the last kind of anarchy-inspired examples of the student movement. And that was really interesting to me, because some of the cooperators I have talked to self-define themselves as anarchists. And there's another picture that we've seen before, which is Hakeem. So the one when we went to Sea Salt, when we had the national gathering at Sussex University last May, and then this amazing dinner that was hosted at Sea Salt. But you can see a lot of kind of anarchist symbols around there. Now, when I asked students, what do you mean by anarchists, right? They told me about Colin Ward, who I hadn't heard about at the time, but I've since been reading a lot of his stuff. To describe it kind of as a social anarchist, he wrote a book in 1974 called Tenants Take Over, from which I've kind of my student takeover title here. But what Ward was arguing is that that tenants should be in control of the housing. If you put tenants, if you give them autonomy, put them in control of the housing, this is how you build kind of successful, livable models of housing. So it was kind of the everyday practices of dwelling. And Ward's writing have inspired quite a few of the co-op founders. The interesting thing I just wanted to bring in here, since we are at the AA Ward himself was very much inspired by John Turner, who was an architect planner who actually taught at the AA in the 1970s. So I thought that was a really interesting parallel. And John Turner was really famous for self-built housing, especially in Latin America, developed a model that became really influential with the likes of the United Nations, the World Bank. There was a bit of criticism of that kind of that institutionalization. But again, this idea of autonomy and putting dwellers in control of the housing is the way to go to build, affordable, democratic, sustainable housing, which is very much what, from my understanding, student cooperative housing is all about. So I just wanted to kind of bringing this idea of anarchism, which is kind of flowing around in these co-ops. Then moving right along, again, we've heard quite a bit about sea salt, so I want to spend a couple of minutes on the other two. Sheffield Cooperative opened its doors in 2016. What's interesting about Sheffield, that's the one that started really differently, because it started as the MA project of an architecture student at Sheffield University. So not so much a group of activists, but a student who was studying architecture and had heard about North American co-ops, had lived in a housing co-op in Europe, in Scandinavia for a while, and was thinking, can we build a similar model in the UK, but especially for transient population? So she was really interested in, can we make this working for students? It was quite a theoretical project, but then she became part of the business plan competition, so a kind of a social enterprise incubator at Sheffield University. And she actually, so as part of that, she developed the business plan, won the business plan competition, and then got access to resources and to some finance, which then allowed her to start the Sheffield Student Housing Co-op, which is a kind of a five-bedroom house, so it's quite a bit smaller. And then the house in the middle, and it's really interesting what May said this morning about stripping out the plasterboards to make that one room fit. So there was, for a very short time, a house in Nottingham, which was also a student housing co-op. It was bought, and then when they had to convert it into an MHO or something, one of the bedrooms wasn't quite big enough. And they were, again, working with an architect, trying to make it work, because it had to be a certain number of bedrooms to be financially viable. And they just couldn't make it work. And they had to sell the house. So again, these local regulations and how much this is constrained by architectural details is quite interesting. And then obviously sea salt. I think the interesting thing about sea salt was that they managed to pull it off in spite of COVID, and very consciously saying, we want to make this happen in Brighton, and a really expensive, overheated housing market. If we can make this happen in Brighton, we can show it's possible everywhere, which is again was quite a determination of the students. And there's a quote from Ruthie speaking to something that I think Lisa said this morning in terms of trying to create almost like a mainstream alternative to the heavily financialized housing. So I think last but not least then, where to next? Again, a lot of these things have been said already, but we have active groups in a number of different cities. We have student co-op homes now as the umbrella organization, but we also have these proven models in Europe. It's actually only in Germany and Switzerland. There is actually not that many student housing co-ops in Europe. I'm just starting to do my research there. So there's a big one in Berlin, then there's the big one in Geneva, Lesigi, but not that many others. But it's really in the States where you have long-standing, really big, successful co-ops. Although, as I think Francesco said, some of them are much more institutionalized. They might not even be recognizable as the co-ops, but there are models out there, and I think learning from them and then pushing the powers to be that need to be pushed in the UK is one of the ways to go forward. And I'll leave it at that.